Elizabeth II, Queen of the United Kingdom, at the service of her country for 60 years.
There's nobody else on earth that has that experience.
Although she wears the imperial state crown, the political power in her kingdom is wielded by others. 12 prime ministers have held office during her reign. Tradition demands that once a week they report to Her Majesty at Buckingham Palace.
All of them come to find it one of the most treasured moments of the week.
These meetings are strictly confidential.
It is never ever leaked from Buckingham Palace, ever, what a Queen has said to a Prime Minister or a Prime Minister to the Queen.
We take a look behind the facade and we discover secret power games, rivalries, but also genuine friendships. The British love their Queen. Maybe because she doesn't talk much. Certainly not about politics.
I'd love to get inside her head because she has known every statesman, every leader, every head of state, every prime minister, every president for 60 years. It's amazing.
It's often said she's never put a foot wrong, and that is true. But she has understood the importance of silence, of not expressing her opinions, of not reacting.
Number 10 Downing Street is the headquarters of Her Majesty's government. From here, the Prime Minister starts every week on a little business trip. A mile away is Buckingham Palace. Here, he's expected for his weekly audience with the Queen. It's been a tradition for the last 300 years. The Queen has already met 12 Prime Ministers. The first was Winston Churchill, a paternal friend. Her relationship with Prime Minister number 5, the Labour lefty Harold Wilson, was particularly close. At the end of the 70s, we see the first female Prime Minister, Margareth Thatcher, the Iron Lady. Equally difficult was her relationship with the young Tony Blair. Neither he nor her latest Prime Minister, David Cameron, had been born when she held her first audience in 1952.
The rest of us in Britain love this. We love the idea that once a week, the Prime Minister, even if we voted for him, has to go and bow the knee to somebody. That's his greatest significance of all, that once a week, the powerful Prime Minister with all his connections and everything has to go and give an account, has to literally bow the knee to somebody who represents something bigger than him.
So Prime Minister's job is a tremendously pressured job, a tremendously lonely job. And to have someone who can be dispassionate and objective and give you advice and warning and encouragement at times, that can be invaluable for you.
During the audience, the Queen listens more than she talks. But she's always well prepared and guides the conversation by asking the right questions. During her youth, Elizabeth spends many carefree summers in the countryside. She's a conscientious, modest, down-to-earth girl.
I think the secret to understand Elizabeth II's success is to realize she was not born to be a queen. For the first 11 years of her life, she was royal. She developed all the reverence for royalty for her grandfather, George V. But there was no prospect of her becoming queen, so it never went to her head. I think the fact that she is not a conceited person is the essence of her success. Suddenly, in 1936, her grandfather, whom she actually called Grandpa England, died, to be succeeded by Uncle David, as she called him. That was King Edward VIII. And within months, King Edward VIII is wanting to marry an American divorcee. He's being thrown out of his job by the British people. Who's to take his place? The stuttering George VI. He had an enormous respect for the monarchy, and the constitutional monarchy in particular, and that's what he inculcated into his daughter.
Years after the coronation of her father, George VI, the Second World War breaks out. Even during the Blitz, Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the royal family stay in London to boost the morale of their people. During the victory celebrations on the 8th of May 1945, 1 million Britons celebrate Elizabeth's family and their Prime Minister. The close relationship between her father and his people impresses her so much that she makes a solemn vow on her 21st birthday.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
Soon, on February the 6th, 1952, she has to fulfill her pledge. Her father dies of lung cancer. Elizabeth cancels a holiday trip. Winston Churchill greets her back home.
Everybody who lived through it will remember the moment when the door opened and this young girl appeared at the top. The first time, really, of many occasions in her reign, that she brought reassurance to the country.
And then began the life of service. But she was probably better prepared for it than other girls of sort of 25 would have been, because she is such a dutiful person and she always wanted to do her best, but it can't have been easy.
Out of respect for her father, Elizabeth waits 16 months before she is finally crowned on the 2nd of June 1953. She's been conscientiously preparing for this moment. She's worked on state papers for months. 3 million spectators cheer the young woman, who at this moment becomes Queen of the United Kingdom and of 15 other countries. Her old friend Winston Churchill becomes her first Prime Minister. The 78-year-old Churchill has known Elizabeth since she was born. When she was only 2 years old, she already impressed him with her authority and thoughtfulness. Now, during their first audience, it becomes clear that he feels a lot more for her than just respect.
I think there's a sense in which all the Queen's prime ministers have been in love with her to a certain degree, but it was most overtly displayed by Churchill. He made no pretense at it. There were tears in his eyes when he welcomed her. Sentimentally, he loved the comparisons with Queen Elizabeth, with Queen Victoria, and the fact that this would be a sort of last act in his life.
I think the Queen valued my grandfather's experience And he, of course, loved the Queen, and he did love her. I mean, he really, she aroused in him all his romantic ideas of sovereignty and monarchy, and the new Elizabethan age, which he referred to.
But they also have their differences. Churchill has fought 5 wars for the empire, and he wants to retain Britain's global supremacy by force, if necessary. Elizabeth, on the other hand, favours a loose confederation of states. 5 months after her coronation, she embarks on a world tour to promote the Commonwealth. Churchill doesn't think much of this idea.
My grandfather was a child of a Victorian empire, and you wouldn't expect him, I think, to be overjoyed, probably, but he was a pragmatist, Churchill, and he understood the movement of events and history and time.
But unlike his young queen, Churchill has difficulties adapting to Britain's new role in the world. He doggedly fights against the dissolution of the empire, and he's increasingly plagued by depression.
My grandmother tried very hard to get him to retire after the war and to end his political career in a great wave of glory. But he couldn't. He was like an old warhorse, you know, he couldn't give it up.
Then Churchill has a stroke. Officially, he says that he suffers from exhaustion, but Elizabeth knows the truth.
She must have been very moved by the occasion because, you know, this was her first Prime Minister. She had known him all her natural life. And it was the end of an era. The end of an era, as you say, the end of, you know, looking back on the end of the empire, in a way, a signal era, end of an era.
On April the 4th, 1955, Churchill invites his Queen to a farewell dinner at Downing Street. 3 days later, he leaves office. In the years after, Elizabeth settles in as head of state. Each year, she opens Parliament in a lavish ceremony, and each year, she reads a speech that she hasn't written. The Prime Minister puts his words into her mouth.
Today, for the first time, this ceremony is being watched not only by those who are present in this chamber, but by many millions of my subjects.
Elizabeth is Britain's best ambassador. She meets Marilyn Monroe and other Hollywood stars. The Queen, who doesn't have a passport, tours the world. And although she never talks about politics, she is Britain's most important diplomat. Back home, her kingdom is in upheaval. The 60s usher in a new era. The young rebel against everything that smacks of tradition. After decades of conservative rule, the Britons want somebody who's a bit more modern. The new Prime Minister is called Harold Wilson, the Labour Party leader.
Everybody, the establishment, were absolutely terrified of Wilson when he was in power. I mean, what was he going to do next?
Elizabeth's conservative advisers warn her, Wilson's supposed to be a lefty, and plans a social revolution.
There was quite a lot of trepidation in Buckingham Palace as to what this chap would be like. But to their surprise, they found that Wilson himself was quite a monarchist, a royalist.
Elizabeth's advisers forget that Harold Wilson is not only the leader of the Labour Party, but also an Oxford Don. Elizabeth enjoys chatting with him.
Wilson, I think, was the first to treat her as an equal, and not look down on her, and certainly to make it clear that he wasn't looking down on her.
But Wilson's government is facing huge problems. The industry is still suffering from the consequences of World War II, and exports are low because trade with the former colonies has broken down.
The British economy was weak, it was overmanned, the trade unions had a tremendous amount of power, and our productivity was much lower than almost every other European country. And Harold Wilson wanted to try and turn Britain into a modern economy, but he came up against lots and lots of distrust and animosity from the trade unions.
The workers rise up against Wilson. They want him to nationalise the coal and steel industries and go on strike. The palace doesn't understand the rift between the workers and the Labour Party, but the Prime Minister can explain.
He saw himself as teaching her a lot about whole sections of her kingdom, which she didn't really know from first hand. You know, from first hand, she knew the kind of things that old-fashioned Conservative prime ministers did, like going shooting and having grand country house parties. But she didn't really know about the trade unions. She didn't really know about how the Labour Party worked.
On the other hand, the Queen surprises her Prime Minister with her detailed knowledge of politics.
Interestingly, over the years, Harold Wilson's audiences with the Queen's agreement, became longer and longer, and he would stay for drinks afterwards.
That has never happened before. Alcohol used to be taboo during the audiences, and now brandy and gin are being served.
It proved to be a very, very cosy relationship. He took a great deal of interest in her second family. The Queen had two families, Charles and Anne. Then she suspended childbirth for 6 or 7 years because she became Queen. And she then had a second family, Andrew and Edward. These were little boys, bicycles and prams in the palace when Harold Wilson was there. And deliberately or cynically or whatever, he took a great deal of interest in these children. He, for his part, found that the Queen was very solicitous about his health. That she was worried when he worked too much. She was worried when he was traveling here or there. And he found that very touching, and a very warm relationship was created.
The Prime Minister spends his summer holidays with his family in Cornwall. Picnicking and golfing, Harold Wilson loves the country life. Just like his Queen, she traditionally spends her summer holidays up in Scotland and invites all Prime Ministers for a weekend to Balmoral.
On the second day, a big barbecue is cooked. And it's cooked by the Duke of Edinburgh, and the Queen herself does the washing up. And Harold Wilson thought it was great to go to Balmoral.
There's a paradox here, because Wilson loved the traditional way of life of the royal family, at the same time that he and his party were changing it. Homosexuality gets liberalized, divorce gets liberalized, abortion gets liberalized. immigration, of bringing people from other countries. That gets liberalised in all sorts of ways. Britain becomes modern under Harold Wilson.
In the industrial cities of the north, the riots are becoming more violent. High inflation rates, unemployment, and endless strikes turn Britain into the sick man of Europe. In March 1976, after 8 years in power, the exasperated Prime Minister requests a private audience with the Queen.
No one ever really knows 100% why Harold Wilson resigned, but those closest to him believe he knew that he was losing his faculties. His memory wasn't what it had been. He was repeating himself. He was drinking quite a lot. He needed quite a lot of brandy before he answered Prime Minister's questions in the House. And I did ask him myself about why he resigned. He said, it's because I've been here so long that I've seen the questions coming round, and they're coming round again and coming round again, and I don't have any new answers. So I decided it was time to go.
Over the next 3 years, an ambitious grocer's daughter from Lincolnshire fights her way to the top of the Conservative Party. Her goal? The government bench.
Margareth Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979, and she was determined to confront what she saw as the enemies within, the enemies of the state, by which she largely meant the trades unions, and to try and crush union power. And the scene was set for bloody confrontation.
Yes, I am an Iron Lady. After all, it wasn't a bad thing to be an Iron Duke.
Margaret Thatcher's arrival at Downing Street is the result of hard work. The advertising agency Saatchi & Saatchi designed her campaign. She employed a style consultant and a voice coach. She leaves nothing to chance.
Well, she was talkative, incredibly argumentative, loved arguing. Fierce in argument, respected people who stood up to her and argued with her. Extremely well organised, punctual, did her work overnight, you might say an official's dream.
The Queen and Margaret Thatcher. The state opening of Parliament in 1979 sees two women who are both the same age, equally ambitious and status conscious. A catfight is inevitable.
Britain was unique in these years. We had a head of state and a chief executive who were both female. Stuffy old Britain was ahead of the game in this sense. And you have these two women, a woman who loved confrontation, that's Mrs. Thatcher, with a woman, the Queen, who'd do anything to avoid an argument. I mean, one of the reasons the Queen is a successful constitutional monarch is that she much prefers to agree than disagree. She hates a row.
I don't think that the Queen and Margaret Thatcher hated each other, but I think there were lots of elements, certainly in the early days of their relationship, where they rubbed each other up the wrong way.
Margaret Thatcher immediately deregulates the financial markets. The stock market is booming. A free market means wealth for all, she says. And she boosts the economy by privatizing state enterprises. Meanwhile, the gap between the rich and the poor widens.
The ladies not for turning.
She quells protests with force.
There was more social unrest, riots, strikes, and lack of social cohesion under Margaret Thatcher than at any other time, partly because she felt she had to grasp the nettle, and her style was confrontational. And there is evidence that the Queen herself was deeply unhappy about what went on for a lot of the time under Mrs. Thatcher.
Whenever she goes to see the Queen, she reverts to the grocer's daughter. Thatcher always arrives a quarter of an hour too early for her weekly audience. And every week, the Queen lets her wait for 15 minutes.
I think Margaret Thatcher was more nervous about everything than people made out early on. Margaret Thatcher was extremely respectful of the monarchy. She is a monarchist, and she was very respectful to the Queen. You've only got to look at her curtsying to the Queen to realise just how much respect there were. I mean, she went so low that I sometimes wondered whether she would get up again.
But Thatcher's curtsies don't impress Elizabeth.
The stage was set for quite a lot of confrontation, and for quite a long time. They were quite sticky, the audiences with the Queen, and I don't think they ever. Mrs. Thatcher is not someone that you can just sit down and kick your shoes off with and sort of have a glass of whiskey late at night. They were both quite aware of their own status.
I mean, one of the best examples of the Queen and Thatcher not quite getting on was that Margaret Thatcher apparently rang up the palace one day to say that she was going to a big dinner that night that the Queen would be at, and she wanted to know what colour the Queen was wearing so that she wouldn't clash with the Queen. And back came the reply from the Queen, "Don't worry, the Queen never notices what other women are wearing." So put down, you know.
Finally, the rift between the two ladies becomes public. The Sunday Times headline says it all. Apparently, the Queen's press secretary suggested that Her Majesty feels the policies of her Prime Minister are socially unjust. Thatcher's advisers are horrified. Elizabeth responds immediately and sorts out the matter in her own way, quickly and discreetly.
When the story came out, Mrs. Thatcher was staying with the Queen in Edinburgh, at Holyrood House in Edinburgh. She had a big dinner, and she put Michael Shea, the press secretary, who was being fingered as the source of the story, between Mrs. Thatcher and the Queen herself. And Michael Shea apologised to Mrs. Thatcher and said, "No, I'm sorry this story's come out like this. It's not what I said." And Mrs. Thatcher leant over to Michael Shea and said, There, dear, don't get upset. We're quite content about this." But in the manner of the way the palace works, Michael Shea somehow left his job a few weeks later.
The two ladies also disagree on foreign affairs. The Commonwealth countries want Thatcher to take a stance against the apartheid regime in South Africa. But the Prime Minister doesn't want to be bothered with the problems of the Commonwealth.
The black African countries were fed up with white Britain effectively supporting, slowing down the sanctions. And they knew that Margaret Thatcher was part of this. She had actually delayed debates, stopped debates in the British Parliament about sanctions.
Against Thatcher's will, Elizabeth travels to a meeting of Commonwealth countries, effectively supporting their claims. Thatcher must give in and is forced to the sidelines. And at home, the royal family is more popular than ever. On July the 29th, 1981, Prince Charles marries Diana Spencer.
On the day, it was wonderful. It was just, the whole nation celebrated. You know, it was a lovely fairy tale love story. There's never been another wedding, in my view, that could equal it. It was just wonderful. The bride was the most beautiful. The whole world was interested in that wedding. The sad thing was that the prince wasn't.
Thatcher's popularity is sinking as she introduces the poll tax. 250,000 people take to the streets in London alone. Rioting breaks out and more than 100 people are injured. The country is in turmoil. In the end, even her own party has had enough of Margaret Thatcher. John Major, her finance minister, succeeds her. She leaves Downing Street in tears. In this difficult time, Elizabeth is showing sympathy towards her beleaguered Prime Minister.
In the end, I think they did get on, and I think that Mrs. Thatcher came to value the advice that the Queen gave her.
The Queen was very upset by the way in which Mrs. Thatcher was deposed by the Conservative Party, and she told somebody that, all right, Mrs. Thatcher may have been tired and things, but it was a horrible way that it was done. And that's why I think it was very important that there was the Queen kind of waiting in the wings.
If you want confirmation of the mutual respect, then just look how quickly the Queen honoured Margaret Thatcher after she'd resigned, with first of all the Order of Merit and then the Lady of the Garter. But I think the fact that she did that is a signal of her respect for what to me, who to me was a quite remarkable Prime Minister in person.
Politically, Elizabeth's kingdom returns to normal. But suddenly, her family life becomes a target for the tabloid press. In 1992, her son Andrew and his wife Sarah separate, and then Charles and Diana's marriage breaks down.
The poor Queen, you know, I was thinking, gosh, she's been on the throne a long time and now it's all falling apart. She was called the mother of a dysfunctional family. They all thought that, you know, it was her fault that her children had bad marriages. I mean, the monarchy was under threat because people thought, well, what's the point of having a monarchy like that? You know, they're all scandals going on all the time, and it was just a disaster. And then suddenly in December they announced that Charles and Diana would separate. Everybody thought, God, what else can happen? It's terrible. And then suddenly Windsor Castle burst into flames. It was on fire. An electrician left some hot object around and it set fire to the curtains, and then the whole place went up. And in a funny way, although it was another disaster, it gained some sympathy for the Queen. They thought, oh, the poor woman, what else can go wrong, you know?
During a reception in November, the Queen admits that she is shaken.
1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
The mood in the country is bleak. The government of Prime Minister John Major seems lacklustre and scandal-prone. Britain is yearning for a fresh start. 43-year-old Tony Blair is the Labour Party's new hope. He looks fresh and promises to change things.
Victory at the next general election.
And indeed, on May the 2nd, 1997, Tony Blair enters Downing Street with a landslide victory.
Blair came into office with an enormous majority, so I think it would have been quite natural that the palace might have been a little bit scared as to what he was going to do with it, as it were. And, you know, he was very, very cocky when he started out. He walked to the state opening of Parliament holding his wife's hand, which made the state procession look slightly sort of antiquated, or at least that was the impression. It was all New Labour, it was always, you know, cool Britannia, it was all, everything was going to change, things were going to apparently get better.
During their first audience, Elizabeth cuts her young, self-confident Prime Minister down to size.
When Tony Blair first became Prime Minister, his very first audience with the Queen, he told me, the Queen said, "Ah, Mr. Blair, welcome to your first audience as Prime Minister. Of course, my first Prime Minister was Winston Churchill, and you weren't even born then." And he said that put me in my place straight away.
However, after a while, Tony Blair seems to enjoy the audiences with his Queen, but large sections of his party think the monarchy is out of date.
His own approach to the monarchy was a little schizophrenic, because for the Labour Party, it was important to demonstrate to many of their supporters that they were a modern party who were not overly overawed by traditions and by institutions such as the monarchy. But on the other hand, they were also determined to show that they were now a responsible party in power, doing the things that any party with a large majority does. And having a good relationship with the palace and with the monarchy is part of being a responsible and powerful government.
On August the 31st, 1997, 3 months after Blair takes office, Princess Diana dies in a car accident. Her death turns into a test for the relationship between the Queen and her Prime Minister. Elizabeth is on summer vacation in Balmoral. She hears the news of Diana's death in the morning.
The Queen's first concern was her grandsons, William and Harry. She said to Prince Charles, "We must take the radios out of their rooms." Then she clicked on the television across all the channels, and of course every channel had pictures of the dead princess, the crash. Her life was endlessly rehashed. She said, "We've got to get them out. We've got to get them up on the hills. Organize a barbecue for them this evening." Her preoccupation was with her own family, and she forgot that she had another family down in England, us, all weeping and laying our wreaths and feeling that we had been deprived. And when she did come to think about us, she shrugged her shoulders and thought, well, you can all get on with it.
Tony Blair, however, comforts his grieving nation straight away. Just hours after the accident, he steps up to the microphones.
Prime Minister, can we please have your reaction to the news?
I feel like everyone else in this country today, utterly devastated. Our thoughts and prayers are with Princess Diana's family, in particular her 2 sons, the 2 boys. Our hearts go out to them. She was the people's princess. And that's how she will stay, how she will remain in our hearts and in our memories forever.
Tony Blair summed up those feelings of shock and devastation that most people in the country felt.
The grief over Diana's death turns into rage against the silent Queen. The newspapers attack Elizabeth.
The extraordinary emotions that came out in the country, the gap between that and the way the royal family seemed totally standoffish and everything like that. And Blair did advise the Queen via Prince Charles as to how she, the Queen, should behave. And he'd only been Prime Minister for about 3 months. To be advising the monarch as to how she should behave towards her own people was quite a tricky thing.
The Queen and her Prime Minister confer every day. He urges her to address her people.
I guess history will say that the week in which the Queen was slow to come back from Balmoral was a mistake, not necessarily a personal mistake, but a mistake of the institution. Actually, I think it's unfair because it was for the best of reasons to protect the grandsons at the most terrible time after their mother's death. But history judges harshly, and that will be one of the judgments.
Five days after Diana's death, Elizabeth finally returns to London.
The atmosphere changed at that moment as she came back. And she and the Duke of Edinburgh walked amongst the crowds and looked at flowers and then came into Buckingham Palace. And I remember when they came inside, I was there with the group of people sort of meeting them. And we were all talking, and they were in some ways as puzzled as everybody else with what had happened, with the phenomenon of so many people.
Downing Street and the palace agree that the Queen must make a speech showing that she shares the grief of her people. The Queen's private secretaries mull over the wording.
Just at the last minute, they sent it to Downing Street, not for approval, but to see if they had any ideas. And it was Campbell who diffidently suggested, on Tony Blair's behalf, could Her Majesty perhaps say, speaking as a grandmother? And they grabbed it.
So what I say to you now, as your Queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart. First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being. In good times and bad, she never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness.
Thanks to Blair's bright idea, the Queen wins back the hearts of her people. But her relationship with the Prime Minister remains difficult. At her 50th wedding anniversary, Blair blabs about the highly confidential audiences. For a moment, Elizabeth loses her eternal smile.
Actually, Your Majesty's closing words to me at Buckingham Palace on Tuesday, at the end of our weekly session, were, please don't be too effusive.
No British Prime Minister can afford such a mishap. Maybe one of the reasons why Blair's audiences with Elizabeth are often over after just 20 minutes.
You are our Queen, with a keen sense of humour and a mean ability for mimicry.
Tony Blair's own memoirs about the Queen are quite interesting in terms of how you get on with the Queen. He said, sometimes you can let her be matey with you, be sort of friendly and informal with you, but you should never try and do that with her, because if you do, then you get the look. And it's quite interesting, because Tony liked to be matey with everyone.
9/11, a global catastrophe, and a new trial for the relationship between Tony Blair and Elizabeth. Tony Blair immediately sidles up to US President George W. Bush. Together, they declare war on terror. Tony Blair sends 46,000 soldiers to fight in Iraq. As head of state, Elizabeth feels responsible for them.
The concern that the Queen had was for her own forces, the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, the Queen's Army, because there were many reports about how ill-equipped they were to deal with desert warfare, and they didn't have the right clothing, the right protective equipment, or even the right ammunition and hardware. And I'm sure that the Queen, during those audiences, would use the Socratic method. Mr. Blair, do you think you may have read this report and that kind of thing?
In 2007, the Daily Telegraph reports that Elizabeth doesn't agree with Tony Blair's policy. She apparently thinks he neglects the Commonwealth and is too close to America. The coalition with the United States puts too much burden on British troops. And her people raise their voices in protest against Blair's war on terror. On the 27th of June 2007, Tony Blair hands the power over to Gordon Brown.
Au revoir, auf Wiedersehen and arrivederci. And that is that, the end.
He vacates Downing Street and makes room for his successor. The farewell is simple. The Blairs simply disappear to their Sedgefield constituency. And now David Cameron is in power, Elizabeth's 12th Prime Minister. When he was born, she had already been Queen for 14 years.
And we have some deep and pressing problems.
Cameron's relationship with Elizabeth is much to her liking, efficient and discreet. And on April the 29th, 2011, Prince William and his wife Kate delight their fans with another fairy tale wedding. The monarchy is more popular than ever.
Her greatest success is her continuity, her ability to move with the times and not look like a fusty, fuddy-duddy old reactionary. On the other hand, could she have moved a little bit more? Could she have seemed a little bit more human? But the great Victorian constitutional historian Walter Bagehot said, "Be very careful. Don't let daylight shine in on the magic." And it's a very, very difficult balance. And I think she's let some daylight shine in, and it hasn't spoilt the magic.
Discreet and reliable. That's how 12 Prime Ministers have experienced the Queen. The governments come and go, but the Queen stays on. She is the symbol of continuity. During the past 60 years, the Queen has held nearly 3,000 audiences with her prime ministers. No one has more experience in office, and no one talks less about it.
The Queen herself has only ever once talked publicly, very briefly, about the audiences. And she said, I've had quite a lot of prime ministers since Winston. Some stayed longer than others. And I think when they come to this audience, they can unburden themselves. They can really tell me what's going on. And I feel, she said, I'm like a sponge. It all goes in. Some goes out of the other ear, but none of it ever comes out in public. It's all there, and I remember.
Elizabeth's power lies in her acts, not in her words.
My lords, pray be seated.
She has never openly meddled with politics.
My government's legislative programme.
But every Prime Minister knows, governing with Queen Elizabeth is smart. Governing against her is impossible.